I am the Senior Strategy Director with ElderWorks, and we welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Please be sure that your video is off, which I think most people are, and that you are muted. If you have questions during the presentation or following it, please put them in the chat box and we'll be more than happy to get them responded to for you. At ElderWorks, as most of you hopefully know, we help seniors, families, and professionals really finding any kind of services they need. Most importantly, we're non-for-profit, so we do not charge for our services. And we have very excellent partnerships and relationships with most all senior communities, in-home care agencies. In addition to that, with many of the resources. One of the things that I want to be sure you think of and leave here with today following our presentation is that ElderWorks is your resource. So feel free at any time to reach out to us. I have put my information in the chat box and we'll add it again for you. And please be sure to know that we are always here and always available. It's our pleasure today and my personal pleasure to welcome Julie Kim with us. Julie is a social worker. She is a victim advocate and social services and an investigator with the Skokie Police Department. It was my pleasure and really benefit to meet Julie some time ago. And she's agreed to give us a wonderful presentation today. So Julie, why don't you go ahead and start? And if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat box. We'll try to address them going through or afterwards following the presentation. I'm going to take my video off also. Julie, thanks so much. And please go right on ahead.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Like Carol said, my name is Julie Kim. I'm the social worker with Skokie Police. I've been here for 23 years. I love what I do. It's a very fulfilling job. I'm a social worker and also a victim advocate, meaning I am available to assist victims of crime that have occurred within Skokie. I'm also available for anybody that reaches out to me in the community looking for some type of social work help or social service referrals. I believe that Carol may have given you a copy of my outline. I tend to be a talker, so please stop me. Don't hesitate to, put a question in the chat box. And then I think Carol is going to read those. But I absolutely want to get to everybody's questions. So the majority of my cases come from domestic violence police reports. Some of those result in arrest and others do not. I try to follow up with all of them. When I say domestic violence, a lot of people think of physical abuse, but it can take many, many forms. And when I say physical abuse, it's interesting because a lot of victims will say to me, I was only pushed. I'm not a victim of domestic violence. I don't have a black eye. And I'll always say, well, actually pushing is a form of domestic violence. And sometimes that comes as a surprise to them. Other times they don't like me saying that. A lot of victims tend to be very protective of the offenders because there is that domestic relationship. And when I say domestic relationship, that's defined as people that are either currently or formerly married or dating a person that is two people that are related by blood or marriage, two people that are living within the same household, like a roommate situation or family members. And then also it can be a relationship in which there's a caregiver and then the person receiving care. That can also be what's considered a domestic relationship. So any of those types of relationships by statute fall under the domestic violence category when there's something such as physical abuse, which is, like I said, is not just a black eye. It could be pushing, kicking, pulling hair, slapping. It can be all sorts of things. It doesn't mean it's not domestic violence if you can't see an injury. Okay. Domestic violence can also be criminal damage to property. So if somebody is destroying your property, breaking your items, things like that, that's domestic violence. It can be telephone harassment, meaning if somebody is harassing somebody by telephone or text messages or email or social media, something that is harassing in nature. It might be the content of the communication, such as threats to harm or kill somebody. It might be name calling. It might be the number of texts or phone calls. So for example, if the victim says to the offender, if they say, I no longer want to have contact with you, please stop calling me. And they continue to call. Every single case is different, but it can be considered telephone harassment. I mean, I'll see police reports where sometimes a person comes in and says, you know what, this person's called me 50 times today and 100 times yesterday. Now that's an extreme example. But my point is that you can make police reports for that type of harassment. There can also be aggravated assault, meaning a person makes a threat to another person while holding something that can be used as a weapon. For example, you know, a baseball bat or a knife or something like that. That's called aggravated assault. Assault can be a verbal threat. Stalking, where a person is following someone or watching them, surveilling them. These are all crimes of domestic violence. Any of these types of issues, we always encourage a victim to come forwards, whether that is by calling 911 in a crisis, or if it's coming to the police department and making a police report at the front desk, if it's not necessarily, you know, an emergent situation in which you need help right then and there. What I will always say to victims is call 911, and the first thing that I want you to say, if you don't think you have a lot of time to talk, is say your address so that the police know where to respond to, and then say your name, and then give as much information as you can give, you know, to the police if you don't think you're going to have a lot of time. So when I have a domestic violence case that I see, I will call them, and if it resulted in an arrest, I'll call them, I'll explain to them what's going to happen at the bond hearing, and I will also explain what an order of protection means, how it works, and I will write that up for them the way they're requesting that it be written up. And then we go in front of the judge and we wait and we see if it's approved in that way. If there is not an arrest, a criminal arrest, I will explain to people that there are other advocates up at the courthouse that can help people get a civil order of protection, civil meaning an arrest has not occurred at this time. So a lot of people think, well, I can't get an order of protection if there wasn't an arrest, but that's not true. You can. There's also a third way that you can potentially get an order of protection, and that's in domestic relations court, meaning part of a divorce case or a child custody case, something like that. So those are the three different ways that you can pursue an order of protection. I also make a lot of phone calls for police reports classified as domestic disturbances. What that means is domestic, meaning there's that type of relationship, and a disturbance, meaning it's something along the lines of a verbal argument, but no crime has occurred. So I'll follow up with a lot of those reports, make sure that in fact, there was not any violence. And I'll just talk to them about what do you think would be helpful. Are you, if I'm picking up that maybe there was recent domestic violence and maybe it was a week ago, but they didn't make a police report. I'll talk to them about civil order protection. I'll see if they need a domestic violence shelter. I'll explain to them, okay, this is what would happen if you did call 911. This is what would happen if you did proceed with a criminal case, in the future or at that time, if that's the situation. I will give counseling referrals if that's what the person is looking for. By the way, just a side note, I can tell you that if there's domestic violence going on in a relationship, it's really is not recommended that couple go for couples counseling, because sometimes I heard this at a conference and I thought it was very interesting. They said, if the offender does not work through their anger issues by going through some type of domestic violence intimate partner program to learn how to control their anger issues, because oftentimes victims will say, oh, well, he doesn't want to go himself, but he'll go if I go with him together. The risk there is that if you're pursuing it from a marriage standpoint or a couples counseling standpoint, the victim might be putting herself or himself at risk, because counseling together can be difficult. You're talking about some issues that are hard to discuss. Emotions might be high. And then on the way home or when you get home, the alleged offender might say, you weren't supposed to talk about that. I can't believe you said that to the therapist. And then there might be another type of domestic violence situation. So the recommendation is usually the alleged offender go and get the domestic violence anger type of treatment, and then the victim can get her own supportive type of counseling services. And then when that's been done, maybe at some point in the future, maybe the couple can come back together when they're dealing better with their own issues, where it could be more of a productive type of relationship. So I deal with a lot of different victims, and some are really wanting to go forward with maybe a criminal case, or some want to really get out of that abusive relationship, and others will say, I don't want any help and everything is fine, thank you. And that's fine. Not everybody's ready to receive help, but I tried to give them their options of this is what's available. And now you have my name and number. Please reach out to me in the future if you ever need help. I also will become involved sometimes with child abuse cases or elder abuse cases. If you see the outline I have there, I wrote down the toll-free numbers of the child abuse and neglect hotline. Some of you may have heard that it's called Department of Children and Family Services. People call it DCFS. It's 1-800-25-ABUSE. The reason why I put anonymous there, that does not at all mean that you have to be anonymous to call. I simply kind of wrote that down, meaning if it makes you feel better, if you are too nervous or afraid for some reason to call that hotline, it can be anonymous. However, I can tell you that both the child abuse and elder abuse protected agencies, they will never, ever reveal who called, not even to the police. There's been times where I wasn't crystal clear on whether or not an officer remembered to call one of these hotlines, and I'll actually call and say, I'm not sure if I need to make another report because I think an officer made one. Can you just tell me if they made a report? And they refuse to do it. They're like, no, that information is confidential. So we'll just take another report from you if one was already made. So they take that very, very seriously. If somebody's, if they go out and do a home visit, which very oftentimes they will follow up with a home visit after a hotline report. It depends whether or not they feel it fits that criteria for them to then take it further and do a home visit. A lot of times people will say, oh, I bet I know who called. I bet it was so-and-so. And they'll just say, I can't confirm or deny that. That's their answer. So it can be helpful for you to give your name and phone number because sometimes that investigator or caseworker will want to call you up and say, can you give me a little bit, more information, because I'm just not clear what this was when you reported it. I have some basic information, but now I have some more specific questions. And so it's very helpful when they do in fact have your name and number. Okay, but I just put anonymous on there because they would, the hotlines would rather receive the information than not receive it at all. So if you don't want to leave your number, you don't have to, but it is helpful if you're willing to do that. Oftentimes the police will work hand in hand with these protective agencies. So for example, if I come across a police report and I'm thinking, I think this is one that really protective services needs to know about, I will call and I'll tell them, this is the situation. Are you willing to take a report? And they'll tell me yes or no. But then I feel better knowing I did my job and now it's kind of in their hands. Now, if it seemed criminal in nature, it might be assigned to a detective for further follow-up. And if elder abuse or child abuse agency, if they get the information first, but it sounds like a police report wasn't made, then they'll tell us, we'd like to make a police report because it sounds like it's criminal. So we work very much hand in hand. As far as sex assault, this is a list of usually when the officers will involve me. So I'm not involved with every single child abuse case or every, sexual assault case, but I am with some of them. By the way, I should preface my entire seminar on, oh, I'm sorry, Carol. It says you don't have an outline. I'm sorry, I will get that to Carol after this presentation, and then hopefully she can email it out to all of you. So I'm sorry, maybe some of you are taking notes. I don't know.
We can send it out. I just wanted to send that over that we do not have an outline.
I apologize for everyone.
No problem. No problem. Thanks.
All right. So not every single police department has a social worker. However, many do, and it's not going to hurt to ask. You can always call your local police department and ask, do you have a victim advocate? Do you have a police social worker? Quite a few of the towns in the northern suburbs, northwestern suburbs, and western suburbs do have social workers, as well as some of the southern suburbs. So we have somewhere between 40 and 50 police social workers within Cook County, DuPage, Kane, and Will. It's not at all to say that you will not get, good service if your police department does not have a social worker. There are victim advocates up at the courthouses, and there are, many social service agencies within your community that can assist as well. As far as sex assault cases, sometimes they'll ask me to respond to an emergency room to give that victim support. If a case goes into criminal court, I can be their court advocate as well. I kind of assess people's support systems and ask if they're interested in counseling. If you're a victim of crime, there is also something called a crime victim compensation application, which is through the Attorney General's office, through the state. And what that is for certain types of crimes, if you have a financial loss, you can put in an application to them, and if it's approved, it will give you reimbursement for certain things, such as medical appointments, counseling, maybe you had to move somewhere else. There's a lot of different things, but that's a program through the state, but just want to let you know that that's something that is available. Neighbor disturbances, we have a lot of neighbor disturbances for various reasons. If it's something that keeps happening and there's no crime, but it's simply neighbors that are constantly calling the police on each other. We have something that we can refer to an outside agency, and it's called, my mind is a blank, neighbor mediation. So it's not so much counseling in the sense of we're trying to get these neighbors to be friends. That's not what it is, but it's simply trying to mediate the differences and trying to come up with a plan going forward to kind of solve the problem. The issue is that oftentimes one neighbor wants it and the other one says, absolutely not. You're not putting me in the same room with this person, which, by the way, ever since COVID, I have a feeling that a lot of the mediation is done via Zoom, but I'm not sure. That's not done through me. But again, just something I want you to be aware of. It might be available in your community. The police also respond to a lot of mental health calls. We're seeing it more so now than ever before. I think, there's been an increase ever since COVID, but I think there's a lot of different factors going into why we're seeing a lot of these calls. One thing that you can request is what's called a CIT officer. That means it's an officer that has specifically been trained in responding to these types of calls. But let me make clear, all officers have received training responding to mental health calls. But if you would like to request a CIT officer, when you call the police, by all means, you can feel free to ask, do you have a CIT officer available? There are also more departments that are developing what's called a co-responder unit. We've had one here for the past year. I'm not a part of that because I spend a lot of time in court doing other things, but we have another social worker here. He's teamed up with an officer and they will respond to a lot of calls when there's mental health involved or substance abuse issues or homelessness, things like that, where it's not just a call that's criminal in nature, but where this is a person that is also clearly in need of some type of social service help. So, and they're in plain clothes and they drive a plain car. So sometimes people find that they're a little bit more receptive to that because it's not just people, officers in uniforms. Although the uniform officers usually respond there first. And then if they feel like they want the co-responder unit to respond, they'll meet them there and they can really sit down with them, sometimes spend a lot more time with them and give them whatever social service referrals are needed. So this is a new program and not very many towns have that, but some do. And then when we come in contact with a homeless person, we cannot force them to go to a shelter, but the offer is certainly made. Would you like us to take you to a shelter? And a lot of people will absolutely refuse and say, nope, I don't want to do that. Officers will also ask that person, are you in need of any medical services? Because we can take you to the hospital as well. Sometimes they'll say yes, and sometimes they'll say no. But again, it's simply giving the person the choice of these are the options available. Do you need any help? And it's up to them what type of help, they're willing to receive. Let's see. I'm on call 24 hours a day, every day of the year. So for example, if there's a real serious case that cannot wait until the next day I'm working, such as a suicide, a homicide, a very, very severe domestic violence or sex assault or something like that, I can get called in, and my role is more kind of supportive in nature. And sometimes it's just sitting with the person because they're just in crisis and they need somebody to talk to, somebody to cry to. And, you know, oftentimes the officers are very busy taking care of the criminal aspect of it. So that's when I respond to kind of respond to more of the emotional needs of that person at that time. A lot of times also I'll just have a lot of call-ins, a lot of walk-ins to just say, how can you help me? This is what's going on. I don't need an officer, but I really just need to know how to get my adult child help. So I'll kind of explain the different options there as well. Now I want to talk a little bit about the various type of protective court orders. The one that I think most people have heard of is called order of protection. A lot of people call it restraining order. In Illinois, they're called orders of protection. Orders of protection are specifically for people that have that domestic relationship that I mentioned earlier. So currently or formerly dating or married, related through blood, or a marriage, living in the same household, or if there's a caregiver that's abusing or neglecting you in some way. So there has to be a recent incident. At the Skokie courthouse, usually the judges like to see there's something as recent as maybe the past week, week and a half, maybe 2 weeks, but something recent. And usually the whole basis of an order of protection is that that person needs to be protected. They feel unsafe. They feel afraid based on recent events. So there's a reason why they're coming forward at this time. And it's usually because there's been a recent incident putting that person in fear. So, and because you do have to explain all of this to the judge about why you're coming forward today, when was the last incident, and you really have to be able to articulate what's been going on, both on paper, as well as be able to answer any of the judge's questions. If the judge feels that you meet that threshold for that order to be approved, then the judge can sign an emergency order of protection. The offender, by the way, is not in court. This is just the victim coming forward. If the judge signs that order, then the sheriff in your county can go out to serve that person with that order. They'll get a copy of whatever is written so that they clearly know what they can and cannot do. When it's served, it's entered into a national police database, and it goes into effect when it's served. So if that person disobeys that protective order after it's been served, then it's up to the victim, or the petitioner is what it's called on the paperwork, to then call 911 and say, I have an order of protection against this person, and I see this person outside of my home. The police take that very seriously, and they'll come out to the home. And more often than not, if that offender or respondent is the way it's listed on the paperwork, if that person is still outside the home at a place where this person was ordered not to be, the chances of that person being arrested for a crime that's called violation of order of protection is more likely than not. So that's when there's a domestic relationship. And with an emergency order of protection, civil order of protection, both parties are supposed to go back into court in 3 weeks for what's called a hearing, where both people have an opportunity to tell the judge why they feel that they want it, what's been happening or hasn't been happening, and then a judge makes a final decision as far as whether or not to extend that order up to 2 years. When it's in criminal court, that order of protection can last throughout the duration of the criminal case. And again, at the end of the case, it can be extended on a longer term basis. But the only way that an order can be enforced is if the victim, that petitioner, is willing to call 911 and report it to the police. That's the only way it can be enforced. There is something called a stalking no contact order, which is another type of protective order for people that do not have a domestic relationship. So it's a non-domestic relationship, meaning something like neighbors or former friends or coworkers or acquaintances, where you feel that you are being harassed, threatened, stalked in some way. There has to be some type of stalking, meaning either a person is following you or they're waiting outside your home, they're waiting outside your work. They are, intentionally trying to wait for you, going to a place where they really have no business being necessarily, for the whole goal of wanting to have this contact with this person. So that's called a stalking no contact order. It's also a civil order, but again, just like the order of protection, if it's violated, that is a crime and the person can be arrested. A civil no contact order is specifically for victims of some type of sexual assault or unwanted, inappropriate sexual behavior. So that's another type of order. With all these types of orders, you do have to have the paperwork written up, whether that's by yourself or an advocate, and then you do have to go in front of a judge. A lot of people will call me saying, can I come to the police department? I want a restraining order, but you do have to go in front of a judge. It is free, by the way. And then there's a fairly new type of order, which is called a firearm restraining order. I think this became a new order, I want to say in 2017, 2018. A lot of people still have never heard of this type of order, and they're really trying to get the word out. So I thought that it might be good to mention it today. The only people that can be a petitioner, meaning the person pursuing it in court, it can be either a family member of the person, the respondent, the person that they're trying to get the order against. It could be a family member, a household member, or a law enforcement officer. So the whole point of this order is, if you have reason to believe that this is a person who has told you, or you have knowledge that this person is going to use a gun to commit a crime, to try to hurt or kill other people, or possibly even themselves, the best thing to do is to go to your local police department and say, can you please help me with a firearm restraining order? Because the police, they should absolutely know, because they should help to investigate this. Because the first thing that they would probably do is they're going to do a well-being check, which, by the way, anybody can request. So if you have reason to believe somebody's going to hurt themselves or somebody else, or if you cannot get a hold of a family member, which might be a senior or a person who lives alone and is struggling with some kind of health issues, and you haven't been able to reach them in a day or 2 days or 3 days. We got phone calls on a daily basis saying, can you please go check on this person? I think the phone is off the hook, or I am not able to reach them, or I just got a text that's very worrisome and I'm afraid they're going to hurt themselves or somebody else. This is their address. Officers will absolutely go out and talk to this person. You're never going to get in trouble for requesting a well-being check. We would rather have people call than not call to make sure that this person is okay. But as far as the firearm restraining order, you know, you can call the police, you can go to the front desk and say, this, you know, this is my reason for concern. Can you help me get this, you know, firearm restraining order? And they'll take all the information, and they may very well ask you to come to court with them. The officer will figure out whether or not they will be the petitioner or you will be the petitioner. I've gone in front of the judge, I think maybe 6 or 7 times. And I would say that maybe half have been approved and half have not been approved. But it's always better to try. You have nothing to lose. You don't need an attorney, and it is free. For those people, sometimes the judge will say to me, well, if a person has a domestic relationship, they don't, you know, I'll approve an order of protection, but I don't necessarily need to approve the firearm restraining order. It's really up to the judge how they're going to do that, because there is also a box that can be checked on the order of protection saying this person cannot own any firearms or a firearm registration card. So, you know, nobody expects that you're going to know all of this, but I would always encourage you, reach out to the police and say, I don't know what to do. Can you help me? And they'll point you in the right direction. Okay, looking at the time here. I want to make sure that I get to everybody's questions. As far as what you can do to help somebody that you know, a person that you have mental health concerns about. And I get these phone calls from family members all the time. If that person is not in crisis right at that moment, I will always encourage somebody, if you know, your son's doctor's name, the doctor or psychiatrist who is treating them, call them and let them know what's going on. A lot of times people will say to me, well, I don't think that my son's doctor is going to call me because he never signed the consent for me to talk to him. And I'll say, that's okay. Something that you can try and see if it works is say, I know you're not allowed to talk to me, but I'm just asking you to listen. I think it's really important that you know this. And so sometimes that might help for the doctor to know that. It's just something for you to try. If the person is in crisis because they're threatening to harm themselves or somebody else, or it seems like they are not in touch with reality, they're making things that don't make sense. It seems like maybe they are hallucinating, seeing things that aren't really there, hearing things that nobody else can hear. If it seems like they're getting a little bit aggressive and they're not coming down, these would all be reasons that you may want to call 911 and say, can you help me? I think my family member might need to go to the hospital. And also if you have reason to believe that they have been thinking about harming themselves or someone else, it's really important that you call 911 to try to get that person help. Like I mentioned earlier, you can request a CIT officer or co-responder team. If there's some type of medical emergency, you can ask for a paramedic. Usually when you call 911, they'll ask, do you need police, fire, or an ambulance? And sometimes, police and maybe fire or paramedic will both respond. If it's a situation where maybe that person needs to go to the hospital. Every single case is a little bit differently. So sometimes the officers, if they fit that criteria to be taken to the hospital, then they can take them. Sometimes they're going to fit that criteria and sometimes they won't. The criteria for what's called an involuntary petition is that either they're thinking about harming or killing themselves, they're thinking about harming or killing somebody else, or the last one is inability to care for self. So it's kind of like extreme cases. It's not just, well, they haven't taken their medication for, today or the last couple of days. It's things like they haven't eaten in days, they haven't slept in days, they don't know who I am, they're totally out of touch with reality. They're very paranoid. They're saying things that don't make sense. The police may or may not be able to take them to the emergency room. But again, I just want to get across, the point that if you have concerns, if this person really you feel like is in need of help, it really is okay to call 911, and the police are going to help you in whatever the way they can. There's also something called a writ of detention, which is basically a court order of the involuntary petition. So you're presenting all the information to the judge, and usually there is a mental health state's attorney that can assist in this process. You would have to call your local courthouse and ask, do you have a mental health court there? Can you put me in touch with a mental health state's attorney? And so they'll kind of help to write up the court documents, and then you go in front of a judge, and the judge might ask you, a few questions. And then the judge will make the decision whether or not to sign this writ of detention. If it's signed, it means that it's good for 72 hours. You take it to your local police department and you say, I have this writ of detention. Can you help me get my family member to the emergency room? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's something that you can try. It does not mean it's going to be an automatic admission to the hospital, but what it means is that hopefully the police can help in transporting the person to the emergency room. But then it's up to the doctor, and only the doctor, to make that decision whether or not a person needs to be admitted. Also, I want all of you to be aware there's a new crisis hotline that is available 24 hours a day, every day. Some of you may have seen it. I've seen a few commercials for it. The phone number is 988. It used to be, a 1-800 number, and apparently they weren't getting the number of phone calls that they thought they would get. So they thought they would make it a little bit easier for everybody. So now it's just 3 numbers, 988. And from what I hear is that the number of calls have increased ever since they just turned it into a 3-digit number. So that's good. And then this 988 call center, if it's a situation where they feel they need to respond to the person wherever they are, they will send out a mobile crisis unit. This plan has just gone into place as of just this past July, and I think they're still kind of implementing the whole process. So very possibly some of you have not heard of 988, but it is available at this time. As far as trying to get a person help for substance abuse issues, again, I would say reach out to their doctor and try to make an appointment. Hopefully the person that is in need of help will agree to go. That's always ideal. If that doesn't work and you feel like this person is in medical crisis, again, call 911, ask for a paramedic. And then they can be taken to the emergency room. There are also a lot of inpatient as well as outpatient substance abuse agencies. If a person qualifies for detox, that would be usually to a hospital, and that would be a doctor's decision whether or not they are eligible to be admitted to that. But there are a lot of residential programs such as Gateway and Rosecrans and Hazelden and several others in this area. And I believe that most of their residential programming is around 21 to 28 days. I'm not sure of all the specifics, but a lot of these substance abuse agencies will have the residential as well as the step-down treatment and the outpatient treatment as well. And then also there are the 12-step support groups, such as Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous. And for family members and friends, there's a support group for them called Al-Anon. You can Google these things, or I don't know if all of you use the internet. I think most people do, but if you Google them, you should be able to find them. And as far as getting help for domestic violence victims, I'm just kind of going to go over this and then we'll open it up for more questions. If you are a neighbor or somebody passing by and you hear somebody yelling, you know, help, help, or you live in an apartment building and you're hearing yelling and crying and somebody saying stop, and, you know, it sounds like things are being thrown around or whatever, I would encourage you to call 911. Again, if you are afraid of getting involved, you don't have to say your name, but you can, you know, or you can say, I'd like to be anonymous, or I'm calling about my neighbor. If you want to give your name, by all means, it could be helpful for the officers or the detectives to figure out what exactly is all going on. But, you know, it's always, I think, better to call than not be called, because you don't know what's going on, and you absolutely will not get in trouble if you do that. If you know of somebody that has told you, I'm in an abusive relationship, you can encourage them or offer to go with them to their local police department for help. There's also an Illinois domestic violence hotline, which is on the outline that I'm going to get to Carol. There's also a national domestic violence hotline as well. And then I explained the options of a civil order of protection. And I also mentioned the hotlines for domestic, DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, and also the Adult Protective Services. Oh, I should mention that when we talk about elder abuse or neglect, that is for anybody over the age of 59 or under the age of 60 if that person has a disability. So either way, if you know that they are either being abused, neglected, threatened, financially exploited, you can call the hotline and give them that information. Also, you can encourage a victim of domestic violence, you know, have you discussed this with your doctor? Of course, if they're hurt, you know, why don't you go to the emergency room, go to the doctor? I know that I've been to the doctor a few times and they're like, we just have to ask these screening questions, and they'll start asking you questions about, are you, and it was funny because my husband was with me and they said, sir, you need to leave. And I'm thinking, and I said, no, he can stay. And they said, no, he can't. We've got to ask you some questions. And they were trying to screen for domestic violence. And then also you can encourage your friend or family member to seek out a domestic violence shelter or seek out domestic violence counseling. If you don't know where to start, you can, you know, reach out to your police department and ask, do you have an advocate? Do you have a social worker there? You know, I'm in need of a domestic violence shelter. And oftentimes there are officers or there are detectives that specialize in domestic violence. So even if they don't have a social worker victim advocate there should be an officer that can answer questions. I'm sorry, I have a knock on the door. He's around here somewhere. Do you have his phone number?
It's
I think they're in the lobby talking to somebody.
okay. All right.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Okay. I think we have some time for questions now.
No problem. Thank you, Julie, very, very much. We appreciate it. I think
Sure.
that we have a great deal of very valuable and important information. When I receive your form, just send it by email. We'll go,
Sure.
or your outline, we'll go ahead and send it out to everyone. And I've
Great.
also put a note in the chat box where you can go on and fill out an evaluation form, which we always appreciate. It puts us in a position to continue giving you and bringing you wonderful programs like this. My experience has been that people are often, as you mentioned, concerned or quote unquote afraid to call in for any type of issues that happen, or by the time they've done it and the police come, things have calmed down and that fear is still there. So I think that's a very good point, but it's important. I've had a few friends or a few people that I've helped, families as well as friends, that have filled out something with their local police called a premise alert. That's what we call it anyway in the area I'm in, which is, for an example, I had a friend that her husband had been diagnosed with some type of dementia, extreme illness, and he always was very calm and easy to get along with, and all of a sudden started to have outbursts. And sometimes she was concerned if she was going to be able to work through that or not. And yes, she had called the police, but she went to the local police department and then filed what we called a premise alert, letting them know what the situation was. Or there's been other instances with families we've helped that have adult children living with them, and maybe the adult child has some type of illness like Downs or something, and what would happen, you know, if someone came to the door and they didn't know this. So do you offer that? Do all police departments have that type of thing available?
Yes. So sure, and that would, it's probably a very good idea if you feel like, yeah, at some point I may have to call 911 and I want them to know this ahead of time. Sure, you can do that absolutely by calling the non-emergency phone number of your local
Right.
police department. For people that have not called ahead of time, usually when police will respond the first time and they'll see like, okay, well, somebody in the household here does have, aggressive tendencies,
Mhm.
or does have, some type of maybe mental health concern that we should be aware of. They will make a note of that if the family hasn't told us beforehand. But yes, by all means, the family can make us aware.
I think the important thing is to at least know there's support there, and to try to reach out for the support, because I think that's difficult. We also have caregiver support groups, because I think as a caregiver for anyone with a chronic illness, it tends to escalate often feelings and emotions on both sides. And so a support group, just as you had mentioned, some of the other ones, hopefully is helpful. I see we do have a question here. Are you looking at it, Julie? If you
I'm
wanted
looking at it right now.
Okay, great. If you wanted to read it out and answer. So I think the question is, does the domestic violence support victims that were victims or are victims of verbal and emotional abuse? From my understanding, the person wrote the physical is an escalation from the verbal.
So yeah, it certainly can be. It's interesting because sometimes I'll talk to victims and they'll say, the abuser will only hit me, but everybody else in my household is safe. Or sometimes you'll hear, oh, well, the abuser will only hit the kids, but not me. It's very interesting because everybody's situation is very unique in and of itself. But yes, oftentimes the physical abuse can certainly go hand in hand with verbal and or emotional abuse. So yes, sometimes it will start out as verbal or emotional, and then it will progress into something else. Maybe it will turn into very controlling behaviors, trying to control the person from not going out, or cut them off for family or friends, or try to limit their financial means. It can really mean a whole lot of different things. And it does tend to get worse over time, not better. So that's what I try to do with the victims that I work with, is just point these things out. Oh, by the way, at least in the courthouse where I work, is when there's a domestic violence arrest, and I cannot speak for all the courthouses because I don't know, but here in District 2, whenever there's a domestic violence arrest, the state's attorneys will work with the victims and ask, do you think this is a situation where the offender would benefit from some type of counseling? And it can be either substance abuse, treatment, mental health treatment, and or intimate partner abuse treatment, meaning where they would have to learn how to better control their anger. And 1, 2, or all 3 of those treatments can be ordered, but they can only be ordered as part of a criminal case, not as part of a civil case. So sometimes there is actually good that can come out of a criminal domestic violence case, but I don't know how they do it at other courthouses.
Thank you. I think the other part of that question, if I'm reading it correctly, and I know you're looking at it also, is they asked the domestic violence support victims that were victims of verbal and emotional abuse. I think they're also asking if that person who receives that type of verbal or emotional could be accepted also at a domestic violence shelter.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I misread the question. That's a great question. And I think it depends on the shelters. My understanding is that a lot of these shelters are full all the time, but they will, have their own screening questions. And it never hurts to call. Because a lot of these shelter programs also have a 24-hour hotline number. So they're available any time of day. And a lot of these programs actually, in addition to the domestic violence shelter, sometimes they'll have legal advocates available for victims once a week. Sometimes they have counseling programs. Sometimes they assist with civil orders of protection. So it's usually not just the shelter. It usually encompasses a whole lot of different services. So I always encourage people to call the shelters, and I have those numbers, and I'll kind of discuss that with victims if I think that's an issue that they need.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think, again, it's a matter of people stepping up and making that first call. It's certainly very different from joining a caregiver support group, but I can say that I have so many families that are dealing with chronic illness, and there are caregiver support groups or other support groups that will be beneficial to them. And sometimes it takes months before people go ahead and do that. And it is sort of one more thing on your list and one more thing you have to address, when truthfully, I think dealing with any of these types of problems, people are just trying to survive day to day and do the best they can and keep things in a calm environment and do what they think is going to be best for everyone. But I think once you get professionals involved, like yourself, Julie, or calling ElderWorks, where we can refer you to the appropriate person or group in your area, police department, state, local, whatever it might be. That first step is always the hardest, but I think once you make that, hopefully you'll find, as you said, even with shelters, there's other resources. So it isn't just one option. They can help you finding other things that hopefully will be beneficial.
By the way, one last comment that could be helpful is sometimes I wonder if some victims of domestic violence are not calling 911 because they are concerned, like, oh, is immigration going to get involved now? I can tell you that officers do not ask and cannot ask, are you a citizen? Are you an immigrant? And even if the victim tells them, I'm not a citizen yet, officers do not call immigration.
Very good information, very good information. Julie, when you send your outline over, I'm sure you have it on there, but would you be willing to put your contact information on it as well, please? And we'll send it out to everyone. I know everyone is living in different areas and probably their local area is the best contact, but nonetheless, we'd like to have it. And I don't see that we have other questions, but thank you so much to everyone for coming today. And Julie, what valuable information, and we'll continue to work together. And I thank you very much for being part and taking your time today to join us.
Sure, thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much. And remember, this will be on YouTube as well as Facebook Live. We've been sending to as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day.